few seconds after the American Airlines MD-82 took off from St. Louis, Missouri, its engine bursts into flames. As the pilots struggle to handle the emergency, alarm bells sound loudly in the cockpit. However, they quickly realize that this is not your typical emergency. The airplane starts to lose critical systems as the captain's instruments malfunction in a matter of moments. Will the fire signal doom for everyone on board, or will the crew be able to return to the airport? This is the account of Flight 1400 on American Airlines. At Missouri's St. Louis Lambert International Airport in the afternoon of September 28, 2007, an American Airlines MD-82 carrying 138 passengers and 5 crew members took off. They had just 1 hour to get north to Chicago, their destination. The day in St. Louis was sunny and comfortable, with light winds, sporadic clouds, and a temperature of roughly 30 degrees Celsius. Overall, it was a pleasant day for flying. However, this picture of flawlessness was misleading. Actually, the passengers were unaware of the extent of the danger they were in as they filed in and found their seats. A very innocuous technical issue and some extremely human errors would clash in a matter of minutes, with terrible results. The 59-year-old captain of this flight had spent the previous 17 years as an American Airlines pilot. For the previous 4 years, 6 months away from retirement, he had returned as a captain on the MD-80 after serving as a first officer on the Boeing 777. He had logged over 14,000 flight hours in total, with 6,000 of those as a captain, making him an extremely experienced pilot. He began his career in 1970 with the U.S. Air Force, and he had an impeccable training and performance record from the time he joined American Airlines. There was a 43-year-old first officer seated to his right, American in 1999, and he had accrued over 7,000 flying hours, 3,000 of which were spent operating the MD-80. Between that and his tenure with the U.S. Air Force and U.S. National Guard. Similar to the captain, he had a spotless performance and safety record while working for American Airlines. However, as we will soon discover, not every issue is evident during training or performance evaluations. As soon as the pilots attempted to start the left-hand engine on Flight 1400, an issue arose. Somehow, it was simply not getting started. The pilots realized that they wouldn't be able to reach Chicago with just one engine, so they phoned the ground crew to manually start the engine. The fan blades are not manually spun during a manual engine start. Instead, the engine start valve is opened by a ground crew member twisting a specialized wrench that is inserted into the engine side. When the valve is open, the engine is subjected to high pressure, which causes the compressor blades in the engine's core to spin and initiates the engine. However, this was not what the ground crew member did when he got to the aircraft. Actually, because it took a long time to find the specific item they needed, it was very much standard policy for ground workers at American Airlines not to follow the protocol as it was written. Hence, to accomplish the identical goal as described in the manuals, the ground crew member used a screwdriver to press a separate button on the engine's bottom. It was difficult for him to press the button because of its location inside the engine, even though he knew he should only use his hand. The left engine finally fired after some back and forth between him and the captain. However, nobody on board realized that the ground crew member's hasty solution had led to a fatal issue. There was a time bomb ticking away deep inside the left engine now. Now that the final bag had been loaded, it was time to move. Many of the guests were excited about their weekend excursion to Chicago, which took place on Friday. That afternoon, at 5 minutes after 1, the aircraft with its full payload of 143 passengers, crew, and luggage pushed back from the gate. The pilots, relieved that the maintenance mishap was behind them, started taxiing out to runway 30L at St. Louis. That day, though, there were other people being careless besides the ground crew. There was a relaxed atmosphere in the cockpit as the pilots taxied out to the runway. With only 6 months until he retired, the captain remarked that he was conflicted. The first officer settled into the mood that he had established in the cockpit and stopped at different times to have informal conversations with the captain as he read out the before takeoff checklist. During the checklist items, the captain conversed with the first officer instead of telling him to stay on task. This type of conversation is definitely prohibited by corporate and FAA rules, which specify that pilots can only talk about matters directly related to the flight until the aircraft reaches a height of 10,000 feet. The sterile cockpit regulation refers to this in the aviation industry. This departure from conventional operating procedure might not have had any repercussions if it had been any other flight. However, this casual approach would leave the pilots totally unprepared for departure on this particular day. The first officer was briefed by the captain on what would happen in the event of a mishap during takeoff, stating, quote, "If we're not on fire, we're going to Chicago. If we are, we're going to return and land here." He had no idea how prophetic this phrase would prove to be. The pilot aligned the aircraft on the runway and activated the engines for takeoff shortly after 10 minutes had passed. The left-hand engine's start valve opened at that same instant. The screwdriver used by the ground team back at the gate had destroyed the electrical switch that controlled its position. And now, one of the engine's starting turbines started spinning as the aircraft accelerated on the runway due to the high-pressure air. This turbine started to freewheel as the aircraft carried on down the runway, gaining a great deal of speed. A tiny annunciator light that wasn't placed where the pilots could see it served as the only clue in the cockpit that this was going on. Thus, the skipper raised the nose to launch the aircraft into the sky as soon as it reached takeoff speed. He had no idea that the left engine was concealing a deadly defect, and neither did the first officer. They hoisted the apparatus and started ascending above St. Louis. The first officer saw a light lit shortly after takeoff, indicating that the left engine start valve was open when the plane flew through 1,500 feet in the air. He brought it up to the captain, who acknowledged the problem. The left engine's quickly spinning turbine catastrophically collapsed as the pilots continued to climb, believing that they would solve the issue in a matter of minutes. Then the engine caught fire. In the cockpit, the signal of an engine fire went off. Declaring an emergency right away, the first officer informed air traffic control that they had a fire in the left engine and that they had to get back to the airport immediately. The controller instructed the pilots to turn right, promising to return them to the airport. The pilots went to work in the interim. While the first officer went over the checklist, the captain said that he would take control of the aircraft. The pilots had been trained to handle emergencies precisely in this manner, the division of responsibilities. When it comes to an airplane fire, time is of the essence. In order to increase the likelihood of their safe return to St. Louis, the pilots needed to cross off a few essential items on their checklists. Taking out his checklists, the first officer turned to the page that listed engine fire damage, and separation. This checklist serves a very simple purpose in the event of an engine fire. It gives the pilots instructions on how to turn off the impacted engine, stop the gasoline supply to it, and extinguish the fire. This checklist has a few more phases, but these are the most crucial ones by far. But suddenly, the pilot started to falter right at the start of this really catastrophic disaster. The pilots will now commit a number of serious mistakes that will put everyone on board in risk, despite their impeccable records and the frequent practice of engine fires in the simulator. The first officer completed the first 2 tasks on the checklist quite fast. He idled the left engine thrust lever and disengaged the auto throttle. However, the captain handed over the controls before he could finish the crucial 3rd step, which involved turning off the engine's gasoline and pulling the fire handle to put out the flames. At this crucial juncture, the first officer ought to have been turning off the flaming engine. He was given the controls by the captain. Why did he do this? Since the passengers were already seated and strapped in, he didn't need to instruct the flight attendants to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing at this point. The fire continued to burn, even with the first officer piloting the aircraft and the checklist in place. As it burned, the electrical wiring was weakened, and the plane's hydraulic systems started to sustain damage. This emergency was going to get much worse in just a few short seconds. The flight attendants were informed by the captain that they would be returning to St. Louis in 5 minutes due to a fire in the left engine. He advised them to prepare the cabin in case they needed to escape, even though they probably wouldn't. This briefing was wholly superfluous at this crucial point in the emergency. The pilot should have only been concerned with operating the aircraft, finishing the engine fire checklist, and finding his way back to the airport. However, the pilot's disregard for regular operating protocols, which they had displayed on the ground, was now catching up with them in the air. Fighter 1400 was directed by the controller to make another right turn, this time to return parallel to runway 30R, where they were being prepared for landing. It was the captain's responsibility to operate the radios and follow the checklists, since the first officer was now piloting the aircraft. Despite having had numerous training sessions, their response to the incident was disorganized and disorganized. The pilot eventually started operating the aircraft again after more than a minute. But it was already too late in a number of significant respects. Both the captain's navigation display here and primary flight display here had failed. The electrical wire powering these instruments was destroyed by the engine fire. The captain can determine his speed, altitude, and heading with the help of these 2 of the most important instruments in the cockpit. He would now be dependent on tiny, antiquated standby devices to view this crucial data. It was a warning indication. What more might get harmed in the background? After more than 15 minutes, the first officer went back to reviewing the engine fire checklist and eventually reached the 3rd step, which required turning off the engine's gasoline supply. However, there was an issue. The switch was unmovable for the first officer. It refused to budge for some reason. Worse, he wouldn't be able to finish the next stage, which was to pull the fire handle to release the 2 fire extinguishers on the engine. Without this, during the initial officer's frantic efforts to extinguish the fire, the cockpit's unsettling fire alarm kept going off. Now, the left engine was producing less thrust. Therefore, the right engine was running at maximum power to make up for it. The pilot was exerting a great deal of effort to steer his damaged aircraft. Now that the left engine was out of commission, he had to step on the right rudder to counteract the left-hand side's swinging motion. There was too much on the pilots. They had to return as soon as possible to the airport. They were going to have more troubles than they knew. The pilots lost more instruments when the electrical systems in the aircraft failed. The left engine's reverse, or unlocking indicator light, was now on, the skipper pointed out. The MD-80's thrust levers seemed like this. It could be catastrophic if one of those deployed while in flight. The pilots could see that the reverser was unlocked because the light was on. But was this accurate? Or was it just more false data produced by the malfunctioning electrical system in the aircraft? The pilots were uneasy. The eerie sirens kept going off, alerting them to the fact that the left engine fire was still very much alive. The first officer was instructed to pull the fire handle by the captain. The first officer had failed to cut the fuel to the engine, which should have been done minutes earlier. To his horror, the extinguishers failed to discharge when the first cop pulled the fire handle. What was going on aboard that plane? The pilots would not have enough time to respond to this inquiry. They had to return quickly to the runway. At this point, in order to prepare the pilots for a landing on St. Louis's runway 30R, air traffic control told them to fly heading 250 degrees. The pilots were pushed to their breaking point. 138 lives were at stake behind them. Then the door to the cockpit flew open. It had now also failed, the electrical locking mechanism that kept it closed. When the first officer attempted to close it, it simply slammed into the door frame and rebounded back. He made numerous attempts, but the door would not close. Their MD-80 was breaking down. Moments from now, Flight 1400 would reach the airport. After dragging their damaged aircraft around the airport, the pilots were going to attempt to limp it onto the runway. The first officer kept attempting, but in vain, to close the cockpit door. In the meantime, the captain had succeeded in releasing the 2 fire bottles into the engine. It seemed at last that the fire had been contained. However, this was not the excellent news that was anticipated. The pilots were about to confront serious damage already caused by the left engine, which had been blazing for such a long time. Now the runway was visible, some 6 miles away. The first officer and the captain talked about their approach speed and flap setting as they flew in the direction of it. In order to give the captain guidance on the appropriate flying speed for the approach, the first officer engaged the landing gear lever, performed some last-minute inspections, and turned on the hydraulic pumps to full capacity. They also installed bugs on the airspeed indicators. To enable the aircraft to slow down for landing, the first officer then dropped the flaps to a 23-degree angle. APU stands for Auxiliary Power Unit, which the captain attempted to start. This would give the aircraft an extra source of hydraulic and electrical power, considering that the right-hand engine was now the only source of power used by the aircraft. But it was not functioning. The pilots couldn't get the APU to start for whatever reason. This wasn't just any old engine fire. Their plane had an extremely significant problem. In all the years they had been flying, the pilots had not been prepared for the extreme complexity and variety of these failures. This was not like any other emergency. Furthermore, the pilots were unaware that their confused response to the first fire warning was what had sparked the situation. However, only a few minutes away from landing and traveling at almost 250 kilometers per hour, there was still no time to think about this. Their sole goal was to return as quickly as possible to the runway while their plane was breaking apart, system after system. air traffic control had juggled emergency services at St. Louis. Ambulances and fire departments were now stationed at the runway, bracing for the worst. However, at this same moment, barely 2 or 3 miles from the runway, Flight 1400 ran into one of its biggest issues to date. The landing gear indicator lights had not come on, as the first officer saw. This was the stuff of nightmares. It seemed that the issues with the aircraft's electrical and hydraulic systems had also extended to the landing gear system. With 3 hours of fuel left in its tanks, the plane would have to land without landing gear, shooting sparks into the air, and possibly starting a flame. However, there had a fallback landing gear mechanism. There was a handle beneath the first officer's seat that could be pushed to manually extend the landing gear. There was only one issue. The pilots had less than a minute left to land, and they couldn't possibly get the gear to stretch in time. However, considering all the electrical issues the aircraft was having, there was an additional option. It's possible that the indicator lights failed, but the gear was in the down position. In a hurry, the captain radioed the tower to inquire if they could verify if the landing gear was extended. The controller reported that while he could see the main gear, it didn't seem like the nose wheel had extended. The pilots had not expected this kind of news. Their goal was to avoid keeping their damaged jet in the air longer than strictly required. However, it was not a safe landing if there was no nose wheel. All they could do was circle about. The pilot raised the nose of the aircraft and slammed the one surviving engine to maximum power. However, it was a risky move. The aircraft was slow and low, weighed a lot, and had its main gear and flaps extended. There was an extreme degree of drag. With just one engine, the pilot managed to push the slowing aircraft into the sky. He was finding it almost impossible to acquire the life-saving speed he needed to keep the plane in the air, with everything working against him. Now, for the first time that day, the flight path itself might not be safe for the aircraft. In addition, the state of the aircraft kept getting worse. The crew's predicament was quickly becoming more dangerous. The skipper was pushed to the brink. He and the first officer had so much work to accomplish now that they were beginning to omit elements of numerous checklists. They had to narrow their attention to the most crucial matters. The 2-person crew was starting to feel overwhelmed by the situation. The captain made contact with a flight attendant, instructing her to summon the off-duty captain who was seated in the passenger cabin to the cockpit right away. The off-duty pilot was up in the cockpit in about 30 seconds. His presence would ease part of the pilot's workload, but given the condition of the plane, there was only so much he could do. As the pilot conversed with air traffic control, he started attempting to shut the cockpit door. The captain informed the controller that he might have to return and land on runway 24 in order to stay near to the airport. Runway 24 did not align with the wind and was significantly shorter than runway 30 left and right. However, the captain was starting to fear that he wouldn't make it back to runway 30 since he was so worried about the plane's incapacity to climb. To assist the captain in gaining some much-needed speed, the first officer turned up the flaps slightly. The aircraft was then gently steered to the right by the captain. Although he was authorized to ascend to 3,000 feet by the controller, his current pace would not allow him to reach that altitude. The skipper didn't want to overstress the remaining engine, even though it was necessary to maintain high engine power. Now, the last thing he wanted was for the one working engine he had to run out of gas and blow up too. The captain informed his co-workers that he was unable to sustain airspeed and that he must return and land right away. Since he was the pilot, he was able to personally observe the aircraft's extreme difficulty in maintaining altitude. Once more attempting to assist with this crucial speed condition, the first officer volunteered to fully retract the flaps. As a result, there would be less drag and the wings would be smoother and smaller. However, the captain feared that by doing so, he would forfeit the life-sustaining lift that the flaps provided. In an attempt to reach a compromise, he instructed the first officer to maintain the extended slats at the front of the wing and retract the flaps at the back, which produced the majority of the drag. The captain reiterated that they had to land right away. He was aware that if they continued to fly, they would either exhaust the last of the engine or slow down to the point where the aircraft would begin to plummet. Not only were the passengers anxious in the back of the plane, but the flight attendants were as well. They could tell that the plane was having trouble landing, and it didn't exactly give them hope that the pilots had called for an off-duty pilot to arrive at the cockpit right away. They were aware that whatever this was, it was very serious. What runway should they land on again? The first officer questioned the captain. The skipper declared his preference for the longest one. That was runway 30 left, the off-duty pilot pointed out, and it was a full 2,000 feet longer than the next longest runway. That 2,000 feet might make all the difference given the aircraft's controllability and hydraulic concerns. The relief pilot then saw something worrisome. The right side of the aircraft was completely devoid of hydraulic pressure. This clarified the reason behind the nose wheel's non-drop. When paired with the deactivation of the left hydraulic system, it partially accounted for the pilot's difficulties maneuvering the aircraft. The controller was now asking the pilots to return for a landing when the aircraft was flying parallel to runway 30L. The flaps had been raised, and although the captain was still having difficulty staying aloft, he was now moving more quickly. As the plane's condition continued to deteriorate, the sense of urgency increased. Selecting this moment, the first officer attempted to lower the landing gear. He should have acted on this sooner, rather than right before landing. The pilots waited as he pulled the gear extension handle under his seat. They heard the sound of the landing gear bay doors opening into the slipstream and the wheels gently dropping, much to their relief. The first officer radioed the tower to inquire if they could see the nose wheel, just to be sure. They could this time. Though the gear indicator lights remained blank, the crew finally got the much-needed proof. They had descended their landing gear. It was now time for the crew to brief the passengers on what to expect, since they were only minutes away from landing. They had been largely unaware of what had been going on up until this time. This time, the passengers were informed via the intercom that they would shortly be making an emergency landing and that they should buckle up and obey the flight attendant's orders. The captain assigned the assignment to the off-duty pilot. A large number of the travelers were afraid. They were unsure of what to anticipate. Lastly, following a stressful taxi ride around the airport, aircraft 1400 was positioned in relation to runway 30L. After the controller gave the all-clear to land, the captain's only task was to carefully guide his aircraft with its 142 passengers and crew onto the runway. The pilot was allowing the aircraft to settle into its desired direction, which was back down towards the ground, rather than pushing it to climb. With order to aid with the plane's landing slowdown, the first officer dropped the flaps to a 28-degree angle. And at last, some positive news. It was the first time the landing gear indicator lights had come on. They were all three green dot, informing the pilots that the gear was locked into place, not only down. Although this was a comfort, the captain was still under a great deal of strain. At all costs, he needed to avoid making another mistake. The runway was directly ahead of the airplane, which was now only 500 feet above the earth. The first officer advised the captain that since he was landing quickly, it would be best to let the plane glide onto the runway by idling the throttle immediately before touchdown. The automatic voice started to count down how high above the runway the plane was. At last, the aircraft made landfall. The swiftly approaching aircraft slid to a halt on the runway as soon as the captain applied the brakes forcefully. The passengers let up a roar of laughter. At last, everyone on board was safe after an incredible ordeal. But even with the favorable result, many unanswered questions remained. What first started the engine fire, and why did it harm people so much? U.S. National Transportation Safety Board investigators set to work right once to try and address these questions. And what they discovered exposed a few serious shortcomings at American Airlines. It found out that the engine's inability to start on the ground at the start of the flight was caused by a disintegrating filter that obstructed airflow to a crucial component of the engine. Investigators discovered that American Airlines maintenance processes were deficient, despite the fact that these procedures should have detected this. Worse, the ground crew thought the engine wouldn't start because of an issue with this filter, but it was actually the air turbine starter valve, or ATSV. In addition, they started the engine using an unauthorized technique, which resulted in the fire that occurred right after takeoff. Thus, American Airlines has issues with maintenance and oversight, in addition to ground crew members who were using unapproved practices. However, the most important lessons to be learned from this incident, in terms of human factors, had to do with the pilot's reactions when the engine fire occurred. Airlines should review their pilot training on task allocation and workload management during emergencies, according to the incident's final report, to make sure that pilots are not performing non-essential tasks like calling flight attendants or speaking with air traffic control when they are running emergency checklists. It's quite likely that the plane would have made a successful first attempt to return to St. Louis if the first officer had followed his engine fire checklist without interruption. One pilot, referenced in the study, posed a hypothetical question. What is the simplest way to get ready to deal with unfortunate events? Events that are familiar to you, but for which there are no set protocols. My education in aviation safety and my flying experience lead me to feel that strict adherence to standards is the solution. Operating guidelines and maintaining order in the cockpit during every flight. You are readying yourself for the unexpected when you act in this way. Because of inadequate management of its maintenance procedures, the Flight 1400 pilots operated in a system that threw the unexpected at them and were ill-prepared for it. In this instance, the Flight 1400 passengers were fortunate to continue as active test participants in this extremely dangerous experiment. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.